A poor girl sees her father unfairly arrested and receives help from a young billionaire. Years later, he loses everything and is falsely accused. The public defender looks at him and says, "Now I defend the one who once defended me." And he is left speechless. The sound of the sirens was a red and blue whirlwind that Anne would never forget. At 6 years old, clutching a teddy bear to her chest, she watched a scene she couldn't fully understand, but that made her heart pound as if it wanted to run away. "Daddy! Daddy!" The shout caught in her throat as the police officers pushed Thomas into the patrol car. The handcuffs gleamed under the morning light of fall, as cold as the fear now taking over her thoughts. Thomas turned his head one last time before the door shut. His eyes, always filled with bedtime stories to tell, now overflowed with a silent despair. "It's going to be all right, little one, I promise." But the promises of grown-ups seemed so fragile at that moment. The neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, gripped Anne's hand tightly, as if the girl might disappear at any moment. "Come on, honey. We have to go to the police station." The 12th Precinct police station was an old brick building that looked as though it swallowed people. Anne eyed the worn steps as she climbed them hand in hand with Mrs. Peterson, each step heavier than the last. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant dominated everything. Loud voices, ringing phones, humming printers, a chaotic symphony that made her head hurt. A police officer in a dark blue uniform pointed to a wooden bench in the hallway. "Wait there, little one. Someone will take care of you soon." Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "I really need to get back to my kids. Will you be okay on your own for a while?" Anne nodded, even though she didn't know the answer. Adults always asked questions they didn't really want answered. The bench was hard and cold, as if it had spent the entire night outside. Anne's short legs barely touched the floor, swinging in mid-air like tiny pendulums. She hugged her teddy bear tighter and whispered into its fuzzy ear, "Mr. Buttons, I'm scared." The hours dragged on. People hurried past, none of them truly seeing the small girl on the oversized bench. Anne watched the doors open and close, swallowing and spitting out adults with serious expressions. Her stomach growled. Breakfast had been interrupted when the police knocked on the door. The bread with strawberry jam was still on the table when they hurried out, along with the half-finished glass of milk and the morning stories Thomas always told. A woman with her hair in a tight bun stopped briefly in front of her. "Are you Thomas Reed's daughter?" Anne nodded, her fingers clutching the worn arm of Mr. Buttons. "We called your aunt. She's on her way, but she lives out of town. It'll take a few hours." Anne didn't have an aunt. She had a godmother who lived far away but only called at Christmas. Maybe it was her, it didn't matter. What mattered was knowing, "Can I see my dad?" The woman straightened a few papers in her folder. "He's being processed now, dear. It's no place for kids." "What does processed mean?" "It's when... well, it's complicated. Just stay here quietly, okay?" And so, Anne went back to being invisible. The bench felt colder now, almost as if it were draining the warmth from her small body. A tear slid silently down her cheek, landing on Mr. Buttons's mended ear. "It's going to be all right," she repeated to the teddy bear, imitating her father's voice. "I promise." Another 2 hours passed. Anne's stomach grumbled loudly now. Her back ached from sitting on the hard bench, and her eyes burned from holding back tears. She had promised her father, the last time he was taken away, that she would be strong. "Big men don't cry over just anything," he used to say. Anne wasn't a big man, but she wanted to be as strong as one. That was when the main door opened, letting in a gust of autumn wind and a man who seemed out of place. Tall, wearing a suit that glimmered discreetly under the station's fluorescent lights, Paul Morrison walked as if the floor should be grateful for supporting him. His watch probably cost more than any officer's annual salary in that building. He paused briefly at reception, exchanged a few words with the sergeant, and continued down the hallway, his Italian leather briefcase swaying gently with each purposeful stride. That's when he saw Anne. Something about the image of the small girl on the oversized bench made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. Maybe it was the contrast between her worn red coat and the institutional grey of the walls. Or maybe it was the teddy bear missing an eye that she clung to, as if it were her last connection to a world that made sense. Anne didn't notice Paul immediately. She was busy counting the floor tiles, a pastime she had invented to distract herself from hunger and fear. 42, 43. Hello? The voice was different from all the others she had heard that day. It wasn't hurried like the officers, nor was it falsely sweet like the social workers. It was firm, but genuinely kind. Anne looked up. The tall man was standing in front of her, not fully crouched. His suit was too fine for that, but bent slightly. Are you here by yourself? Anne nodded, hugging Mr. Buttons. How long have you been waiting? She shrugged. She didn't know how to read clocks with hands, only digital ones. Since the sun was there, she pointed to the window, indicating a position very different from where the sun was now. Paul frowned, glancing around. The receptionist was busy on the phone. Two officers were animatedly discussing a basketball game. Nobody seemed to notice or care about the solitary little girl. Are you hungry? Before Anne could answer, her stomach did so for her, growling audibly. Her cheeks flushed. Paul smiled, not the professional smile he used in court, but something rarer and more genuine. Wait right here. I promise I'll be back in a minute. Anne nodded, though she didn't really believe him. Adults always promised to come back, like her mom had promised 3 years ago. Like the social workers promised every time. Like her dad promised there would be no more trouble. To her surprise, Paul actually returned. In his hands, a sandwich wrapped in paper and a small juice box with a straw. Sorry, the station cafeteria isn't exactly 5-star cuisine. Anne took the sandwich as if it were a precious treasure, unwrapping it carefully. The smell of peanut butter and jelly filled her nose, making her stomach growl even more. What's your name? Paul asked, sitting on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Anne Reed, she said between bites. And this is Mr. Buttons. She held up the teddy bear slightly. Nice to meet you. Anne and Mr. Buttons. I'm Paul. Are you a police officer? She asked, eyeing his expensive suit warily. Paul smiled, adjusting his tie. No, I'm a lawyer. What's that? It's someone who helps people with legal problems. You know when someone is accused of doing something wrong. I help show that things aren't always so simple. Anne stopped chewing, her eyes suddenly more alert. Like my dad. The question took Paul by surprise. Your dad is in trouble, Anne nodded, swallowing the last piece of the sandwich. They took him away again. Mrs. Peterson said this time it's serious. Paul frowned again. Where's your mum? She left a long time ago. Dad said she needed to find her happiness. Anne stuck the straw in the juice box. I guess it wasn't with us. The comment, so mature and sad coming from a 6-year-old, made something twist inside Paul. Wait here, he said, getting up. I'll find out what's happening with your father. At the front desk, Paul used all his charm and status to get information. Thomas Reed, 32, arrested on charges of grand larceny. He worked as a night watchman at a warehouse that was robbed. The evidence suggested an inside job. Cameras switched off at the exact time, alarms deactivated, detailed knowledge of the system. Who's representing him? Sergeant Donovan shrugged. No one yet. Probably a public defender. But with the evidence we have, well, it's a lost cause. Paul returned to the bench where Anne was now loudly slurping the last of her juice. She looked up, a small smear of jelly at the corner of her mouth. Your dad's name is Thomas Reed, right? He works as a night watchman. Anne nodded. At the big warehouse. He works nights so he can take me to school during the day. Her eyes filled with worry. They said he did something bad. Paul hesitated. How do you explain the concept of the presumption of innocence to a 6-year-old? Sometimes people think they know what happened, but they don't have the whole story, he explained gently. That's why everyone deserves someone to tell their side. Anne's green eyes, matching those of her father in the police records Paul had just seen, locked on him with a disconcerting intensity. Can you tell my dad's side? The question hung in the air between them. Paul Morrison was a corporate lawyer of the highest caliber. He made millions defending companies, not night watchmen accused of theft. His time was literally worth $1,000 an hour, and his schedule was always booked weeks in advance. Anne's silent crying was different from the typical overblown drama of children her age. It was contained, as if she already understood that showing pain wouldn't change anything. Her tears fell directly onto Mr. Buttons's worn fur, without sobs or screams, just an ancient sadness unfit for her few years of life. "No one else will help," she murmured, almost to herself. "He said this time would be different, but it never is." Paul felt something stir within him, something that years of Harvard and Wall Street had tried to suppress. Maybe it was the memory of his own father, a mechanic who died trying to give his son a chance he himself never had. Or maybe it was simply the absurdity of a child sitting alone on a cold bench for hours while adults decided her fate without even noticing her. "Anne," he said at last, his voice reclaiming the firmness that had made him famous in the courtroom. "I'm going to talk to your father." Her green eyes widened. "Really? Really? And then we'll figure this whole thing out." When Paul got up and walked to the main desk to inform them he would be representing Thomas Reed, he had no idea that this decision, made in a dull hallway under fluorescent lights in a suburban police station, would change not only the lives of Anne and Thomas, but also his own, in ways he could never have imagined. The bench was still cold, but Anne didn't feel it as much anymore. She watched Paul Morrison disappear behind the double doors leading to the interrogation rooms, and for the first time that day, she whispered to Mr. Buttons, "Maybe grown-ups' promises aren't always empty after all." Paul Morrison had never worked so hard on a case that paid exactly $0. His luxury office on the 20th floor had been turned into a command center for what his partners, not without a touch of irony, called the Lost Project. "You're wasting your time," said Richard, his oldest partner, leaning against the doorframe. "We're turning away clients who would pay fortunes while you kill yourself over a night watchman." Paul didn't take his eyes off the documents scattered across the table. "Are you done?" Richard sighed. "I just don't get it. There are hundreds of unfair cases out there. Why this one?" Paul finally looked up. The image of Anne, sitting alone on that cold bench, hadn't left him. "Because this one crossed my path." And the Suntech logistics warehouse was huge. Endless rows of shelves that nearly touched the ceiling, forklifts buzzing through narrow aisles, and a security system that, according to the prosecution, only an employee could have bypassed so precisely. Paul walked through the place for the third time that week, this time accompanied by the reluctant manager. "Mr. Morrison, I've shown you everything. The system was shut down at 2:17 a.m., exactly during Mr. Reed's patrol." Paul stopped in front of a control panel, and no one else had access to this panel. Only security staff and managers. But the panel logs fingerprints, and guess whose was the last one registered? Thomas's. Exactly. Paul studied the panel intently, and this record is infallible. The manager hesitated briefly. "It's the best on the market." "That's not what I asked." Thomas's apartment was small but clean and organized. Anne slept in the only bedroom, while her father used the couch in the living room. Paul noticed the child's drawings pinned to the fridge, the school books carefully stacked on the table, and a faded photo of Thomas with a woman who smiled, holding a baby Anne. "She left us when Anne was 3, Thomas explained, following Paul's gaze. "Said she wasn't ready to be a mother." Paul nodded. "Tell me about that night." Thomas sat down, running his hands over his tired face. "Like I've said 1,000 times, I did my usual rounds, checked doors, corridors, logged everything on the panels according to procedure. At 3:25, I heard a noise in the east sector. When I got there, I saw the loading door open and at least 2 men loading boxes into a van. I called for backup on the radio and tried to intervene, but they hit me from behind." "And when you woke up?" "I was handcuffed, and police were everywhere. They said I had disabled the system, that my fingerprint was on it." Paul jotted down a few notes. "Thomas, I need to know, do you have any enemies at the company? Anyone who hates you enough to set you up like this?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm not the most popular guy, but that's a stretch. What about money, debts? I make enough to pay the rent and give Anne a decent life. There's not much left, but I don't owe anybody anything." Paul stood up. "One last question. Who covered your shift after you were arrested?" Judge Henderson's courtroom was imposing, lined with dark wood paneling and an atmosphere that could intimidate even the most seasoned lawyers. Paul straightened his tie as he waited. "Proceed, Mr. Morrison," said the judge when he entered. "I have 10 minutes. Paul got right to the point. "Your Honor, I'm requesting full access to Suntech's biometric system records, including all accesses in the last 6 months. Prosecutor Williams stood up immediately. "Objection. This is a fishing expedition. Mr. Morrison is just stalling the inevitable." The judge looked at Paul over his glasses. "Mr. Morrison? Your Honor, I have reason to believe the system may have been compromised. Also, there's a crucial detail. Mr. Reed radioed to report the crime while he was allegedly committing it. Why would a criminal call for backup in the middle of his own crime?" Judge Henderson considered for a moment. "Request granted, Mr. Morrison. But don't test my patience." The week of the trial arrived faster than Paul would have liked. The case had drawn local media attention, not because of the defendant, but because of the billionaire lawyer defending a warehouse night watchman. In the courthouse hallway, Anne waited with a social worker. She wore a simple blue dress, probably her best, and clutched Mr. Buttons firmly in her arms. "Mr. Paul," she called when she saw him, "will everything be okay today?" Paul crouched down to her eye level. "I'm going to do my best, Anne. And then Dad comes home. If all goes well, yes." Her green eyes studied him with that adult intensity that always unsettled him. "Promise?" Paul hesitated. "I promise I'll try with all my strength." The courtroom was packed. Prosecutor Williams presented his case with confidence. Digital evidence, exclusive access, clear opportunity. By the time he finished, many on the jury seemed convinced. Then Paul stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about high-tech systems or scientific evidence. It's about simple logic." He paced slowly before them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Thomas Reed, a man with no prior record, a devoted single father, risked everything to rob his own workplace. And not only that, they want you to believe this supposedly brilliant criminal called for backup in the middle of his own crime." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The prosecution bases its entire case on a single piece of evidence, Thomas's fingerprint on the security panel, a fingerprint that he legitimately left there while doing his job." Paul signaled to his assistant, who projected a chart onto a screen. "These are the complete biometric system logs for the last 6 months. Notice this pattern here," he pointed. "On specific days, there are registration failures of exactly 4 minutes and 38 seconds, 6 identical occurrences, all during the shift of Mike Breslin, a maintenance technician." A murmur ran through the room. "And now, the final piece," Paul continued, projecting another image. Security camera footage from a convenience store 3 blocks from the warehouse, showing Mr. Breslin meeting with Carl Matthews, the Suntech manager, 1 hour before the robbery, the same manager who, curiously, was promoted 3 weeks later. The prosecutor rose to object, but Paul had already planted the seed of doubt. Over the next 2 days, Paul meticulously exposed how Matthews and Breslin had planned everything, using Thomas's shift as a cover. How they had cloned his fingerprint using a mold taken from his coffee cup. How Breslin had the technical knowledge to manipulate the system during his routine maintenance visits. By the time the jury began deliberations, the courtroom atmosphere had completely shifted. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The foreperson stood, paper in hand. "In the case of the state versus Thomas Reed, we find the defendant not guilty on all counts." The sound that filled the room was indescribable, a mix of gasps, whispers, and, from the bench where Anne sat with the social worker, a sob of relief that broke the hearts of all who heard it. Thomas turned to Paul, tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." Paul simply patted his shoulder. "Go home with your daughter, Thomas, she's waiting." Then outside the courthouse, under a sky-threatening rain, Thomas held Anne's hand while speaking to reporters. Paul watched from a distance, ready to leave. Before he could slip away, he felt a tug on his jacket. It was Anne, who had let go of her father's hand and run toward him. Without a word, she hugged him tightly, burying her face in his expensive suit. Mr. Buttons was squeezed between them, a silent witness to that moment. Paul hesitated for an instant, then briefly returned the hug. When she pulled away, her green eyes said everything words couldn't. He smiled, gave a small wave to Thomas in the distance, and turned to head to his waiting car. As the vehicle pulled away, Paul looked one last time in the rearview mirror. Thomas and Anne stood hand in hand, two silhouettes against the grey sky, finally free to begin again. He couldn't know, had no way to know, that this small detour in his life, that impulsive decision to help a girl on a cold bench, would plant a seed that, years later, would bloom in ways that would forever alter the course of his own life. Time passes differently when you have a purpose. For Anne Reed, the years after her father's trial were marked not just by birthdays and school terms, but by a quiet determination that grew alongside her. By age 12, Anne no longer carried Mr. Buttons everywhere, but the teddy bear still had a place of honor on her shelf. Its eyes, now stitched with black thread that didn't quite match the original, seemed to watch over Anne as she studied late into the night. "Dad, there's something I don't understand in this math problem." Thomas looked up from the newspaper. Working as a security guard was in the past. No one wanted to hire a man who, despite being cleared, had once been accused of theft. Now he drove a cab, working longer hours, but at least he could choose when to be home. "Let me see." He moved closer, frowning at the numbers. Math had never been his strong suit. "I think you need to multiply this part first." Anne shook her head. "No, I tried that. It doesn't work." They both stared at the problem for a few minutes until Anne sighed. "I'll ask Mrs. Hernandez tomorrow." She closed her notebook. "Dad, have you heard anything about him? Mr. Morrison?" The question caught Thomas by surprise. It wasn't the first time Anne had mentioned the lawyer who changed their lives, but it had been a while. "No, sweetheart." "Why?" Anne shrugged, pretending indifference. "Just curious. I read about him in the paper last week. He won another big case." Thomas nodded. "He also saw Paul Morrison's name now and then. Huge cases, powerful clients, always victorious, a world completely removed from theirs." "He must be very busy," Thomas said softly, "but he made time to help us." Thomas had no answer for that. By the time she was 15, Anne was top of her class in almost every subject. Her grades in history and literature were flawless, but it was in debate that she truly shone. The school's team had won the regional championship twice under her leadership. "You have a natural gift for argument," said Mrs. Patel, her social studies teacher. "Have you ever considered law school?" Anne felt a warmth rise up her neck. Of course she had considered it. It was practically all she ever thought about. "Maybe," she answered vaguely. "Well, if you decide to go that way, I'd love to write a recommendation letter. You have the potential for the best universities." The best universities. The words echoed in her mind all the way home. In the small apartment she shared with her dad, Anne put her books away and sat at the kitchen table, opening the old laptop they'd bought used the previous year. She searched best law schools and stared at the list. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, names that felt like they belonged to another universe. The annual costs made her stomach drop. Thomas came into the kitchen and saw what she was looking at. "Ambitious, huh?" He smiled, but concern flickered in his eyes. "Just looking," Anne said, closing the laptop. "Nothing serious." Later that night, after her father fell asleep, Anne reopened the laptop. This time she searched Paul Morrison lawyer. Hundreds of results appeared, articles about cases, interviews, photos at gala events. In one picture, he smiled alongside celebrities, looking as comfortable as he did that day in court so many years ago. Anne studied his face. He looked older, of course, but he still had that same quiet confidence, that look that said he knew exactly what he was doing. The next morning, Anne woke up earlier than usual. She made coffee for her dad and waited for him to get ready for work. "Dad, I want to go to law school," she announced when he walked into the kitchen. "I want to be a lawyer." Thomas studied his daughter for a moment. That determination in her green eyes was nothing new to him. He had watched it grow ever since those days in court. "It's going to be tough," he finally said. "I know. We'll need scholarships, a lot of them." "I know," Thomas smiled. "Then let's start researching." The high school passed in a blur of books, prep tests, and extracurriculars. While other teens cared about parties and dates, Anne was focused on a single goal. "You need to relax a bit," said Mia, her only close friend, as Anne turned down another Friday night outing. "There's more to life than studying." Anne smiled without looking up from her SAT prep book. "Maybe for you. What's that supposed to mean?" Anne closed the book, looking at her friend. "It means you have parents who can pay for your college. You don't need a full scholarship to chase your dreams." Mia drew back a little. "That's not fair to say." "No, it's not," Anne agreed, softening her tone. "Sorry, I'm just stressed." But it wasn't just stress. It was a truth Anne had carried since she was 6. The world wasn't fair. And for people like her and her dad, the only way out was to work twice as hard. Acceptance letters started coming in her senior year. 5 reputable universities, all offering partial scholarships based on her outstanding academic record, but none covered enough. "We'll figure something out," Thomas insisted, though both knew that even with student loans, the cost would be overwhelming. Then on a rainy Tuesday, a different letter arrived. Thick paper, elegant logo, Columbia. Full Reed Morrison scholarship for law students with exceptional potential and a commitment to social justice. Anne read the letter 3 times before she could process it. Reed Morrison. That couldn't be a coincidence. "I didn't apply for this scholarship," she muttered, confused. Thomas took the letter with trembling hands. "He didn't forget," he whispered. Anne looked at her father, tears welling up. "You think?" Thomas nodded. "He must have followed your progress somehow. Or maybe he set up this scholarship years ago and your name popped up in the selection." Anne researched the scholarship that same night. It had existed for only 3 years and had supported only 6 students so far. There was no direct mention of Paul Morrison on the official page, only that it was funded by an anonymous donor and the Reed Foundation. Reed, her own last name. "How did he know?" Anne asked her father. "How did he know I wanted to study law?" Thomas smiled. "Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just wanted to give others what he gave you. A chance." Columbia was a world apart. Historic red brick buildings, endless libraries, and people who seemed born discussing international politics and legal theory. In the first days, Anne felt like an intruder. "Reed? I don't know any Judge Reed." "Are your parents lawyers?" a classmate asked during lunch, her drawl indicating generations of privilege. "No, my dad drives a cab." The silence that followed was telling. It wasn't outright hostility, but something perhaps worse, genuine surprise, as though they were face to face with an exotic animal at the zoo. "Oh," the classmate finally said. "How interesting." Anne could have shrunk back. She could have lied. Instead, she lifted her chin. "He's the most honest man I know. He was falsely accused of a crime and cleared by a lawyer who believed in him when nobody else did. That's why I'm here." The table fell silent again, but this time it was different. Some expressions showed genuine curiosity. "Which lawyer?" someone asked. Anne hesitated. She was never sure if she should mention the name, worried it might somehow tarnish the good deed he had done. "Paul Morrison," she finally said. A ripple of murmurs spread across the table. Of course they knew the name. Who in the legal world didn't? "Morrison took a pro bono case for your dad." "That doesn't sound—" "It's true," Anne interrupted. "I was there. I was 6, sitting on a cold bench at the station. He bought me a peanut butter sandwich." This time, the silence was one of respect. The first year of law school was notoriously brutal, but Anne was prepared. While classmates complained about the reading load, she devoured the texts with fierce enthusiasm. Every legal theory, every precedent, every argument was a tool she might someday use to help someone like her dad. Her fascination with criminal law was immediate and visceral. While others leaned toward more lucrative fields like corporate or intellectual property law, Anne knew her path from the start. "Public defense doesn't pay well," warned Professor Stewart during an advising session. "With your record, you could join any elite firm." "I'm not here for the money," Anne replied simply. The professor studied her for a moment. "A lot of first-year students say that by the 3rd years, when debts pile up and job offers roll in, the story changes." "I have no debt," Anne said. I have a full scholarship. The Reed Morrison, the professor nodded. You know, I've never met anyone from that scholarship committee. It's almost like... Like what? Like it was created specifically for someone. For you, maybe. Anne felt her face grow warm. I don't know what you mean, but the idea lingered in her mind. If Paul Morrison really had created a scholarship in her name to ensure she could study law, why had he never contacted her? Why the anonymity? That spring, an internship opportunity arose at the New York Public Defender's Office. It was rare for a first-year student, but Anne applied anyway. To her surprise, she was accepted. Your application essay was impressive, said the attorney who interviewed her. You write like someone who understands what it means to be on the wrong side of the system. I do, Anne answered simply. The experience at the Public Defender's Office was transformative. Stacks of cases, limited resources, desperate clients, everything her classmates would consider a nightmare was exactly where Anne felt most useful. Every small victory, every client who got a second chance, fueled her conviction. One afternoon, while organizing files, Anne found an old case. The name on the folder made her heart leap. Thomas Reed. It was the original file from her father's case, archived over a decade earlier. With trembling hands, Anne opened the folder. There were the documents Paul had gathered, handwritten notes in elegant script, meticulously planned defense strategies. On the last page, something caught her attention. A yellowed post-it note with a simple message. Remember, it's not about winning, it's about doing the right thing. P.M. Anne sat down, the file shaking in her hands. That note hadn't been written for her, but it felt like an answer to the question she'd carried for years. Why did he help? Not for fame, not for ego, not even out of pity. Simply because it was the right thing to do. By the end of the first year, Anne ranked among the top 5 students in her class. Her photo appeared in the law school newspaper as a diversity program success story. How does it feel to be one of the few low-income students at Columbia Law? Asked the campus paper reporter. Anne thought for a moment. Grateful for the opportunity, but also aware that I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else. And what are your plans after graduation? Public defense. I want to represent people who, like my father, find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no one to believe them. The reporter asked a few more questions about her journey and inspirations. Anne answered them all with clarity and determination. When the interview ended, the reporter hesitated. There's one more thing. It's not really for the article, but I've heard rumors about your scholarship. Is it true Paul Morrison created it specifically for you? Anne felt her stomach sink. I can't comment on that. Some say he's been following your career from a distance, that he keeps a file just on you. That would be strange, Anne replied curtly. So, you haven't had any contact with him since your dad's case? Anne grabbed her backpack, ready to end the conversation. Mr. Morrison did something extraordinary for my dad a long time ago. If he created a scholarship, whether for me or for other students, it just shows the kind of person he is. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a test to study for. As she walked across campus, Anne mulled over the reporter's words. The idea that Paul Morrison might be watching her progress from afar was both comforting and unsettling. That night, alone in her dorm room, Anne picked up her phone. She had saved a number years ago, found among her father's case files. She had never dialed it before. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, but at the last moment, she stopped. What would she say? Thanks for the scholarship you may have set up for me. Why haven't you reached out? Some debts couldn't be paid with words. Some inspirations carried more power when left as memories. Anne put the phone away and returned to her books. Her path was clear. She would become the best lawyer possible, defending those who, like her father years ago, desperately needed someone to believe them. If one day her path crossed again with Paul Morrison, it wouldn't be as the little girl crying on a cold bench, nor as the student grateful for a scholarship. It would be as an equal, a lawyer who had learned the most important lesson not from books, but from real life. Sometimes justice needs someone willing to fight for it, even when all odds are against them. The conference room at Blackwell and Monroe took up the entire top floor of a skyscraper overlooking Central Park. Through the large windows, New York looked like a model city, beautiful, organized and distant, exactly how Anne felt at that moment. 300 grand a year to start, said Richard Blackwell, a senior partner, sliding the proposal across the glass table. Annual bonuses, premium health plan, retirement fund, and of course the possibility of partnership in 5 years if you maintain your current performance. Anne looked at the document. The number seemed almost obscene. With that, she could pay for a decent apartment for her dad in a matter of months. She could clear the small debts they had accumulated over the years. She could finally breathe without the constant weight of financial insecurity. "It's a generous offer," she said, keeping her voice neutral. Caroline Monroe, the other senior partner, leaned forward. "Anne, let's be direct. You graduated from Columbia as class valedictorian. Your grades were exceptional and your internships impressive. We have 50 associates begging for this position, but we want you." "Why?" The question slipped out before Anne could stop it. The two partners exchanged quick looks. "Because you have something they don't teach at Harvard or Yale," Blackwell answered. "You have hunger, determination, you understand the real world." "And how do you know that?" Monroe smiled. "We research our candidates thoroughly. We know your story, your father, the case." Anne felt her stomach sink. Of course they knew. Her legal fairy tale had become almost an urban legend in law circles, the poor girl who was inspired by a famous lawyer and was now ready to conquer the world. "We need someone with your unique perspective," Blackwell continued. "It will help our image with certain clients. Diversity of experiences, you understand." Anne understood perfectly. She would be the firm's trophy, a living example that anyone could reach the top through hard work. A sob story to impress clients and justify tough decisions. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Monroe smiled, "but don't take too long." Heidelberg and Associates also showed interest, from what I hear. Thomas was washing dishes when Anne arrived at the small apartment they still shared. Ever since graduating 3 weeks earlier, interviews had become her daily routine. "How did it go?" he asked, drying his hands. Anne dropped the folder on the table. 300,000. "Health plan, retirement." Thomas whistled softly. "Wow. Yeah. You don't look excited." Anne slumped into a chair, letting out a long sigh. "I'm not." Thomas sat across from her. His hair now had silver strands at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened over the years. He still drove a cab, still worked too many hours, still worried constantly about bills. "What's bothering you?" Anne looked at her father. "They want to parade me around as some charity success project, the poor girl who made it." "Is that so bad?" "That's not why I studied so hard." Anne ran a hand through her hair. "Besides, I'd be defending big corporations against people like us." Thomas was silent for a moment. "You got other offers, right?" 5 in total. All similar. Anne nodded. More or less. Huge salaries, fancy offices, powerful clients. And the public defender's office. The question hung between them. The public defender's office, where Anne had interned the past 2 summers, where desks were piled with files, computers were outdated, and lawyers juggled too many cases for modest salaries. "They offered me a position," she finally replied. 62,000 a year. Thomas let out a long breath. "Less than a quarter of what Blackwell offered." "Yes, you've already decided, haven't you?" Anne looked out the small apartment window. Outside, the city kept up its frenetic pace, indifferent to the decisions that shaped individual lives. "I think so." The public defender's office for the Southern District occupied 3 floors of an older building downtown. The paint was peeling in some corners, the elevators often broke down, and the air conditioning seemed to work only on alternate days. Director Grace Chen examined the documents Anne handed over, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "You know you could be earning 5 times more anywhere else, right?" Anne smiled. "I'm aware. And here you'll have 50 cases at once, clients who often miss their hearings and impatient judges." "I'm aware of that too." Grace removed her glasses, studying the young woman before her. "Why, Anne? With your resume, you could choose anywhere." Anne thought for a moment. She could talk about social justice, about giving back, about making a difference. All would be true, but not the whole truth. "When I was 6, I watched my dad get taken away in handcuffs for something he didn't do, she began. I sat alone on a cold bench at the police station for hours. Nobody saw me. It was like I was invisible. Grace listened in silence. Then a lawyer showed up who didn't need to be there, who had far more important clients waiting. He saw me, really saw me, and then he saw my dad, not as a case, not as a statistic, but as a person. Anne paused, gathering her thoughts. I want to be for others what he was for us. I want people sitting on cold benches made invisible by the system to know that someone is fighting for them, even if it seems impossible, even if everyone says it's a lost cause. Grace observed her for a long moment, then smiled. Your desk is over there, she said, pointing to a cramped corner space. The files on the right are your new cases. Preliminary hearing tomorrow at 9 for the first one. The next evening, Anne entered the small apartment exhausted but energized in a way she hadn't felt since her law school days. She had spent 12 full hours reviewing cases, meeting clients, and preparing arguments. Thomas was in the living room, watching the news. His face lit up when he saw her. How was your first day? Anne dropped onto the couch beside him. Chaotic, insane, impossible. Regrets? She smiled, closing her eyes for a moment. Not one bit. Thomas studied his daughter with quiet pride. The frightened girl who had once sat on a cold bench had vanished, replaced by this determined young woman who knew exactly what she wanted. You know, he said after a moment, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Morrison hadn't shown up that day. Anne opened her eyes, staring at the peeling ceiling. Me too. But I guess it doesn't matter anymore. Why not? Because now it's my turn to show up for someone else. She turned to her dad, smiling. And that's what really matters. Thomas nodded, understanding. Anne had made her choice, not the easiest nor the most profitable, but the one that resonated with the deepest truth of who she was. While her father turned his attention back to the television, Anne closed her eyes again. Tomorrow would bring another day full of nearly impossible battles, limited resources, and people desperate for help, and she couldn't be more certain of her decision. Some choices define not just careers but souls, and Anne Reed had found hers. Rain battered the windows of the 50th floor office at Morrison & Winters and Associates. Paul Morrison watched droplets distort the city lights below. 27 years building this empire, 27 years of impossible cases, powerful clients, and memorable wins. Another whiskey, sir? Asked Marta, his assistant of almost 2 decades. Paul nodded without turning around. Thank you, Marta. You can head home afterward like you've stayed past your shift. You really shouldn't be here alone tonight. Not after... I'm fine, he interrupted gently. Just tired. Marta hesitated for a moment, then left the glass and exited quietly. Paul waited to hear the door close before picking up the whiskey. 18-year-old aged in oak barrels, smooth as silk, small luxuries he had grown used to over an extraordinary career. His phone buzzed for the 10th time that hour, probably more journalists, or maybe Lucas Winters, his main partner, with further explanations about the documents that had surfaced. Paul ignored the call and sat in his leather chair. On his desk lay a small stack of newspapers from the previous day, all with variations of the same headline. Scandal hits Morrison & Winters. Documents reveal possible fraud involving pension fund. That was only the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, everything had seemed normal. Paul had just won a high-profile case involving a pharmaceutical company. The legal press called him the Wizard for his near-supernatural ability to turn seemingly lost cases into resounding victories. We need to talk, said Lucas, entering his office without knocking. His usually impassive face showed signs of strain. Good morning to you too, Paul responded, not looking up from the documents he was reviewing. If it's about the Peterson case, I'm already... It's not about a case, Lucas interrupted. It's about the internal audit. That caught Paul's attention. The annual audit was a formality, a standard procedure check, never a cause for concern. Is there a problem? He asked, finally meeting his partner's gaze. Lucas shut the door and lowered his voice. They found irregularities in the firm's investment fund. What kind of irregularities? The kind that send people to prison, Paul frowned. As senior partner, he supervised general operations, but day-to-day financial management was Lucas and Jennifer's responsibility. They had insisted Paul focus on what he did best, winning impossible cases. "Show me," demanded Paul. Lucas hesitated. "It's not that simple. There are your signatures on documents you might not remember signing." "What are you talking about? I don't sign anything without reading it." "Remember that routine paperwork last year about restructuring the investment fund?" Paul tried to recall. "There were so many documents, so many meetings." "Vaguely." "You said it was just bureaucracy." Well, Lucas looked away. Some additional pages may have been slipped in afterward. Realization hit Paul like a punch. "You forged my signature." "No, of course not." Lucas sounded genuinely offended. "You signed. You just didn't know exactly what you were signing." Paul stood, anger rising. "What did you do, Lucas?" "We diverted some investments. Nothing drastic. We just diversified into some alternative opportunities." "How much?" Lucas mumbled something inaudible. "How much?" Paul repeated, his voice sharp as steel. 87 million. The world seemed to tilt beneath Paul's feet. $87 million from the fund meant to secure employee pensions, pay health benefits, ensure the firm's future. Where did the money go? Lucas didn't answer immediately. Private investments. Some didn't pan out. How much was lost? Most of it. Paul sat down slowly, his mind racing. Who else knows? Right now, just the internal auditor, you, me, and Jennifer, but he's required to report it. Soon, everyone will know. In the following days, the storm gathered at frightening speed. What began as a rumor turned into a media hurricane. The perfect story. The renowned attorney Paul Morrison, defender of major corporations, involved in fraud against his own pension fund. At first, Paul thought he could set things straight. After all, he truly had no idea any of this was happening. But then came the documents, his signature clearly visible on papers outlining the scheme, his initials on every page of questionable investment plans, memos apparently written by him, approving suspicious transactions. They're forged, Paul insisted to Jeffrey, his personal lawyer and longtime friend. Jeffrey looked over the documents again. The forensic analysis says it's your signature, Paul, not forged. Real. I would never knowingly sign something like this. I believe you, but proving it, nearly impossible. Paul ran a hand over his face. Where are Lucas and Jennifer now? Jeffrey hesitated. Jennifer took a flight to the Cayman Islands yesterday. Lucas is sick and not answering calls. They left me as the scapegoat, Paul concluded. Seems like it. And they did a meticulous job. Every document is in your computer's digital files. There are emails that appear to have come from your personal account. This is insane. I can prove I wasn't even in the office on some of those dates. Yes, but what about all the other ones? Documents can be pre- or post-dated. You trusted them, Paul. You signed packets of documents without checking each page. They used that against you. Paul stared out the window again. So what now? Now, Jeffrey sighed. Prepare to fight for your life. But the next morning, the story exploded in every newspaper. The Morrison, Winters and Associates pension fund had lost nearly $90 million in fraudulent investments, apparently orchestrated by Paul Morrison himself. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Clients, colleagues, reporters, all demanding explanations. The biggest clients jumped ship almost instantly. Major corporations couldn't afford to be represented by a lawyer under fraud investigation. The shareholders in the Petrox case are withdrawing, Marta informed him, entering with a list. And NorthMed just called. They're terminating their contract. All of them? Paul asked in disbelief. All the major ones, yes. Some smaller clients haven't spoken yet, but Paul shook his head. It's only a matter of time. Within a week, the once bustling office felt like a ghost ship. Associates requested transfers, secretaries resigned. Even the cleaning staff seemed to avoid eye contact. The Bar Association opened disciplinary proceedings. Federal authorities launched a formal investigation. The firm's accounts were frozen. Paul's personal accounts, too. They can't just freeze everything without a trial, Paul protested during a meeting with Jeffrey. They can in a suspected large-scale financial fraud case. It's to prevent you from moving assets. To where? Lucas and Jennifer already took it all. Jeffrey sighed. Not all. We still have some legal angles. But I need to be honest, Paul, things don't look good. Mr. Morrison, how do you respond to accusations that you knowingly diverted pension funds into high-risk investments? A reporter shouted, as Paul left the Bar Association building. No comment, Jeffrey said, guiding Paul through the crowd of journalists. Is it true your license was suspended? Is it true Lucas Winters was seen in the Bahamas? Employees lost their retirement because of you. Any words for them? That last question hit Paul like a bullet. Employees. People who trusted him. People like Marta, who had worked by his side for 2 decades. In the car, finally safe from reporters, Paul broke down. They're right, he murmured. I'm responsible. You were deceived, Jeffrey corrected. I was negligent. I should have checked everything personally. I should have monitored Lucas and Jennifer more closely. Those employees trusted me. Jeffrey had no response to that. 2 months after the first accusations, Paul's situation looked hopeless. The firm had imploded. Employees filed class actions. Clients demanded compensation for breach of contract. Then the final blow. Lucas Winters resurfaced, not in the Bahamas or a country without extradition, but in New York, at the FBI headquarters. He made a deal, Jeffrey explained, his face dark with worry. He'll testify against you. Pauline, sitting in his now half-empty apartment after selling artwork and antiques to cover immediate expenses, let out a humorless laugh. Against me? What could he possibly say? I knew nothing. He says you did know, that the whole thing was your idea, that he and Jennifer just followed your orders. Paul felt the blood drain from his face. That's absurd. Who would believe that? He has emails, Paul, meetings logged on your calendar, witnesses claiming they heard you talk about the investments. All fabricated. The whole thing is fabricated. Probably. But now it's his word against yours, and he has documents. You only have denials. The disciplinary hearing at the Bar Association was swift and ruthless. Paul's temporary suspension became a permanent revocation of his license to practice law. Decades of impeccable work, hundreds of cases won with ethics and skill, all erased with the stroke of a pen. I can appeal, Paul said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. You can, Jeffrey agreed. But first we have to deal with the criminal charges. Lucas's deal has made you the prime target. And Jennifer? No trace. Probably with a new name, a new face, somewhere with beaches and no extradition treaty. Paul looked out the window of his apartment. He had sold his luxury penthouse months ago. Now he lived in a modest 2-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood. Still a privilege compared to many, but the beginning of a downfall that seemed endless. What happens now? He asked, more to himself than to Jeffrey. Now we prepare your criminal defense. But I have to be honest, it might involve pre-trial detention. Paul nodded slowly. That possibility had loomed for weeks. How long? Depends on the judge, but given the scale of the case and flight risk, it could be until the trial, which could take years. Yes. Paul took a deep breath. I need some time. To think. To prepare. Jeffrey patted his shoulder. Of course, I'll be here when you need me. But when Jeffrey left, Paul already knew he wouldn't call him again. He couldn't afford his fees. He could barely afford anything. 3 days later, the modest apartment was empty. Furniture sold. Clothes donated. Only a suitcase remained in the middle of the floor. Paul Morrison, age 56, looked around one last time. The man in the hallway mirror scarcely resembled the confident lawyer who had once ruled courtrooms. Grey hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, an unkempt beard, shoulders weighed down by accusations he couldn't refute. His phone rang. It was Jeffrey, probably worried after days with no contact. Paul let it go to voicemail. There was nothing to say. In his pocket, he had the last $1,000 he could scrape together. Enough for a few weeks in a cheap hotel, maybe. After that, he didn't know. What he did know was that soon the authorities would come with a warrant. Lucas had completed his act of betrayal, presenting new evidence of Paul's supposed orchestration of the scheme. As he left, Paul set an envelope addressed to Jeffrey on the table. Inside was a letter. I'm not running from justice. I'm looking for it. I will find proof of my innocence, no matter how long it takes. Don't look for me. When I have what I need, I'll return. It was a promise almost impossible to keep. How do you prove you didn't know something? How do you expose such meticulous forgeries? How do you fight enemies who know every detail of your life, every habit, every weakness? Paul had no answers. He only had the absolute conviction of his innocence and a desperate determination not to spend years in prison awaiting trial for crimes he did not commit. He closed the apartment door for the last time. In the elevator, he avoided looking at his reflection. In the lobby, he kept his head down. On the street, he walked aimlessly, just another anonymous man in the crowd of New York City. The rain began to fall, thin and cold. Paul turned up his collar, clutching his worn suitcase. Somewhere in this city were answers. Somewhere there was a future beyond ruin. Somewhere there was truth. And as he walked through the rain, the man once called a giant of American law felt smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever thought possible. As small as a child sitting alone on a cold bench at a police station years ago. 6 months later, Paul Morrison's name had faded from the headlines. Occasionally it popped up in articles about the biggest legal scandal of the decade, or in analyses of the downfall of the powerful. But the man himself had become a ghost. The grey-bearded man who walked into the public defender's office one Monday morning looked like just another desperate client. Tired eyes, clothes clean but worn, the kind of person society had discarded. "I need help," he told the receptionist, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm being charged with something I didn't do." "Name?" she asked without lifting her eyes from the form. He hesitated for just a second. "Paul Morrison." The woman kept typing for a moment, then stopped abruptly. Her gaze rose slowly, examining the man with new attention. "Morrison?" "The lawyer." Paul nodded slightly. "I thought you left the country. As you can see, I haven't." The receptionist seemed unsure how to proceed. "You need to fill out this form. Someone will see you shortly." Paul took the form and a pen. He sat on a hard plastic bench in the corner of the waiting room. The questions were simple, direct. Name, address, income. At the address field, he paused. He hadn't had one for months. Finally, he wrote down the name of a shelter where he'd been able to get a temporary bed. In the income field, he wrote 0. When he finished, he handed the form back to the receptionist, who scanned it quickly. "Please wait. A public defender will be with you soon." Paul nodded and returned to the hard bench. He looked around the plain room. Faded posters about legal rights, people waiting, some anxious, others resigned. In another time, another life, he would walk through places like this as a celebrity. Now he was just another person in need. The irony was not lost on him. The man who once defended the powerful now needed a public defender. The giant brought so low he barely recognized his own reflection. A door opened, and an assistant called, "Mr. Morrison, you can come in now." Paul stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the last few months in every muscle. As he walked to the door, he had no idea who awaited him on the other side. He couldn't have imagined that fate had prepared a reunion that would change everything. He didn't know that by stepping into that simple room in the public defender's office, he was about to close a circle that had begun decades earlier on another cold bench with another person in need of help. Morning at the public defender's office started like so many others. Anne arrived at 7:00, an hour before the official start, with a large coffee and the determination of someone who chose to be there. 3 years had passed since she turned down the $1 million offers, and she had never regretted it for a moment. The building was quiet at that hour. Only the janitor and a few lawyers as dedicated as she was occupied the corridors. Anne liked this moment. It gave her time to gather her thoughts before the daily chaos began. Her cubicle was small but organized. Photos of her father smiling, now fully gray-haired, occupied one corner of the desk. Next to them, a worn teddy bear, eyes different from each other, visible patches, stood as a silent reminder of where everything started. "Morning, warrior," said Grace Chen, walking by with a stack of folders. After 3 years, the director had become both mentor and friend. "Ready for another battle?" Anne smiled, raising her mug. "Always." Grace set 3 folders on her desk. 2 are new. The third is a complex case that came in last night. I thought of who could take it, and your name was the first that came to mind. Complex how? A former big shot who fell from grace, accused of large-scale fraud, says he was framed. Anne felt a small tingle of interest. She loved challenges, especially when they involved people the system had already written off. Thanks for your confidence. Grace nodded and moved on, distributing workloads among other defenders arriving for the day. Anne sipped her coffee and opened the first 2 folders: routine cases, a shoplifting incident, a probation violation. She made quick notes, planning the initial steps for each defense. Then she reached the third folder. Thicker than the others, with a small red sticker in the corner, the internal code for high-complexity cases. Anne opened the cover and read the client's name, Paul Morrison. Time simply stopped. The hum of the office became a distant buzz. Her coffee forgotten, eyes fixed on those 2 words. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Yet there it was, in plain black letters on white paper, the name that had shaped her entire life, the name of the man who, 20 years ago, had noticed a small girl on a cold bench and decided to help, changing the course of 2 lives forever. Her trembling fingers turned the file pages. There were newspaper clippings about the scandal, preliminary reports, the intake form he had filled out the day before. The attached photo showed a man different from the one who lived in her memory. Completely grey hair, deep circles under his eyes, an unshaven beard. But the eyes, those same eyes that once offered kindness to a frightened child, had not changed. Anne? You okay? The voice of Miguel, her colleague at the next desk, pulled her back to reality. Yeah, she managed, closing the folder quickly. I just recognized a name. Miguel raised an eyebrow. Old client. Something like that. Anne stood abruptly, folder in hand, and walked to the restroom. She locked herself in a stall and took several deep breaths, trying to calm the whirlwind in her chest. Paul Morrison, the legendary lawyer, the man who inspired her entire career, the reason she was here, in this very office, doing this very job. And now he needed her. Years ago, she obsessively followed news about the scandal. She read every article, every analysis, every speculation. At the time, when Paul Morrison's name appeared linked to fraud, Anne refused to believe it. Not the man she'd met, not the lawyer who had fought for her father when no one else believed him. When he disappeared, newspapers speculated he'd fled to some tax haven. Anne never believed that either. Something was deeply wrong with that whole story, and now, as if in a poorly written novel, he'd reappeared in her life, in need of exactly what he had once offered, someone to believe him when no one else would. Anne left the restroom with determined steps and went straight to Grace's office. The Morrison case, she said without preamble, I want to take it personally. Grace looked up from her computer, surprised. I was going to assign it to you anyway. No, I want to handle it alone. No assistants, no interns. Grace frowned. That's unusual. Do you know the client? Anne hesitated. She could easily say no, take the case, and move on. But lying to Grace felt wrong. Yes, she admitted. Or rather, I did, a long time ago. Oh. Grace leaned back in her chair. How? He defended my dad pro bono when I was 6. A flash of recognition crossed Grace's eyes. Wait, that story you told when you applied here, the lawyer who inspired your career was Paul Morrison. Anne nodded. That's complicated, Anne. It could be a conflict of interest. There's no conflict. I haven't had any contact with him for 20 years. I'm not even sure he'll recognize me. Grace considered for a moment. Why do you want this case so badly? Anne looked out the window at the city stretching beyond. After a moment, she turned back to Grace. Because he believed in my father when everyone said it was a lost cause. Now everyone says his case is a lost cause. I think I deserve a chance to return the favor. Grace studied her for a long moment, then sighed. All right. But at the first sign of an ethical complication, I'll have to reassign it. Understand. Perfectly. Anne sat back down at her desk, now with renewed purpose. She opened the folder and pored over every detail, every accusation, every piece of evidence. It was an intimidating case, large-scale financial fraud, document manipulation, fund embezzlement. On the surface, the evidence against Paul seemed irrefutable, signatures on documents, emails, testimonies, but there was something suspicious about how neatly it all fit together. Almost too convenient. When she finished her initial review, it was already past noon. Paul was scheduled for an intake interview at 2. Anne would have to prepare quickly. She skipped lunch and kept working, making notes, formulating questions, looking up precedents. The irony wasn't lost on her. Years ago, Paul had probably done the exact same thing for her father's case. At 1:45, Anne stored her documents in a neat folder. She stopped by the bathroom to check her reflection. In the mirror, she saw a 26-year-old woman with dark hair pinned in a simple bun, green eyes brimming with resolve, professional, competent, no trace of the frightened 6-year-old from 2 decades prior. She took a deep breath again. "You can do this," she murmured at her reflection. Interview room 3 was the smallest and oldest in the defender's office. Faded beige walls, a metal table with a laminate top, 2 uncomfortable chairs. No frills, no comforts, just the essentials for vital work. Anne arrived a few minutes early, organized her documents on the table, and waited. At exactly 2 o'clock, she heard a knock on the door. "Come in," she called, keeping her voice steady. The door opened, and there he was, Paul Morrison, thinner than the recent photos, older than her memories. He wore worn dress pants and a plain white shirt, no tie. His face showed the fatigue of someone carrying a massive weight for too long. "Good afternoon," he said politely, sitting in the chair she indicated. "Thank you for seeing me." There was no sign of recognition in his eyes. For him, she was just another overworked public defender, young and possibly skeptical of his innocence. "Mr. Morrison," Anne began, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm Anne Reed, and I've been assigned to your case." She watched his face carefully, looking for any reaction to her name. There was none. 20 years was a long time, and Reed was hardly uncommon. The man in front of her was too worried about his own future to connect distant dots. "Before we start," Anne continued, "I'd like you to tell me your version of events, in your own words." Paul straightened in his chair. For a moment, a flicker of the legendary lawyer shone in his eyes. "I was set up by my partners, Lucas Winters and Jennifer Thorne. They diverted funds, forged my signature on documents, planted digital evidence in my systems, and then vanished with the money, leaving me to take the blame." His voice was controlled, but Anne could hear the desperation beneath the surface, the desperation of someone who had repeated the same story countless times, only to be met with disbelief. "What brought you to the public defender's office? As far as I know, Mr. Morrison, you could hire private counsel." A sad smile appeared on his face. "Not anymore. My assets are frozen. My reputation is destroyed. My old friends won't take my calls. I sold everything I could to survive these past months, but now..." He gestured vaguely. "Now I'm here." Anne nodded, making notes. "I understand you disappeared for several months." "I didn't disappear. I just needed time. To find evidence. To understand how they tricked me so completely." "Did you find anything?" Paul hesitated. "Not exactly, but I found some leads. Suspicious transactions by Lucas weeks before the scandal broke. Unrecorded meetings with certain clients. Small details that, aimed together, might start building an alternative story." Anne spent the next 40 minutes asking technical questions about signatures, document dates, office security protocols. Paul answered with a lawyer's precision. But more and more, Anne saw the human behind the professional facade, a man devastated not just by material loss, but by the betrayal of friends he trusted, by the destruction of everything he had built. "In the end, Ms. Reed," he concluded, "I know it looks like a lost cause. The evidence against me is strong and well-crafted. It would be easier for you to advise me to take a deal. Save your time and resources for cases with a better chance." Anne observed him closely. "Would you take a deal?" Paul looked directly into her eyes. "No, I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do, even if it means facing a long trial with a high chance of conviction. Anne nodded slowly. That was exactly what she'd hoped to hear. Why do you think your partners did this? Why you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I was the face of the firm, the most well-known name. If something went wrong, and it did, I'd be the perfect target while they got away. Plus, he hesitated. Plus what? Paul sighed. I guess they never forgave me for certain decisions. What kind of decisions? I used to take on a few pro bono cases that didn't bring in money or prestige, but... He paused, searching for the words. Cases where I could really make a difference for someone in need. Anne's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. Your partners didn't approve. They said it was a waste of resources, that my time was too valuable to throw away on insignificant cases. He smiled faintly. They never understood that those cases were the most significant of all for me. Anne slowly closed the folder. The sound seemed to echo in the small room. For a long moment, she just looked at the man before her, not the legendary lawyer, not the desperate defendant, but the human being who had once shown kindness to a frightened child. Mr. Morrison, she said finally, her voice soft but resolute, I will take your case personally. Thank you, he replied, relief evident. I know it may not seem like it, but I'm innocent. Completely innocent. I believe you. Paul blinked, surprised. You do? Why, most people... Because, Anne interrupted, locking her gaze on his. Now I'm defending the one who once defended me. Confusion crossed Paul's face. He frowned, studying Anne more carefully. Sorry, have we met? Anne gave a small smile. A long time ago. I was 6. Sitting on a cold bench at the police station when a lawyer in an expensive suit stopped and bought me a peanut butter sandwich. Paul's eyes went wide. Slowly, comprehension began to dawn. Anne. Reed. Thomas Reed. My dad, she confirmed quietly. Paul looked stunned. The warehouse theft case, the night watchman who was falsely accused. That's right. The case no one wanted because it looked lost. My God, Paul murmured, running a hand over his face. The little girl with the teddy bear. You... I grew up, Anne finished, and became a lawyer because of what you did that day. Paul was silent for a long moment, absorbing the revelation. Then something else seemed to occur to him. The Columbia Scholarship. Reed Morrison, it was an impressive coincidence, Anne quickly interrupted. This wasn't the moment to discuss who had founded that scholarship. What matters is that I'm here now, and I'm going to do for you what you did for my father. But my case is considered lost, Anne smiled. So was my dad's. A flicker of hope, tentative, cautious, but unmistakable, sparked in Paul's eyes. It was the same look Anne had seen in her father's eyes 20 years earlier, when he realized someone finally believed him. Life really is full of unexpected twists, Paul said at last, a small smile forming on his lips. Anne nodded, reopening the folder. And this is only the first of many we'll create together, Mr. Morrison. Now let's get to work. Anne's apartment had turned into a command center. Every surface was covered with documents, newspaper clippings, and notes. On the walls, a web of photos, index cards, and colored strings illustrated her search for the truth. 3 weeks had passed since she took Paul Morrison's case. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, erratic meals, and growing obsession. Her co-workers noticed the dark circles under her eyes, but respected her dedication. After all, it wasn't every day a former billionaire attorney became their client. We need to follow the money, Anne explained to Paul during one of their daily meetings. Lucas and Jennifer left traces. No one can hide 87 million completely. Paul nodded, looking at the documents spread over the small conference table. I tried for months. The transactions are complex, routed through multiple shell companies. The difference is that now we have legal access to banking records, Anne replied. The defender's office can request warrants that you, as the accused, couldn't. A knock on the door interrupted them. Miguel, one of Anne's colleagues, poked his head in. Anne, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about the Morrison case. Anne frowned. Who? Wouldn't say, waiting at reception. Anne and Paul exchanged glances. "Keep going through these documents," she said, standing. "I'll be right back." In reception, a middle-aged man waited nervously. Well-tailored suit, expensive leather briefcase, a watch likely worth more than Anne's monthly salary. "Ms. Reed," he extended his hand. "I'm Robert Kelly. I worked in the finance department at Morrison Winters for nearly a decade." Anne shook his hand, wary. "How can I help you, Mr. Kelly? May we speak in private?" Minutes later, they were in a small interview room. Kelly straightened his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "I'll get straight to the point, Ms. Reed. I know you're defending Paul Morrison. There are interested parties who would prefer this case not go to trial." Anne kept her expression neutral. "Which parties would those be?" "I'm not authorized to reveal that, but I am authorized to offer compensation for your discretion." "My discretion?" Kelly opened his briefcase and slid an envelope across the table. $100,000. In return, we ask only that you let the case stall. Some procedural errors, missed deadlines, nothing obvious. Anne looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Are you offering me a bribe, Mr. Kelly?" "I prefer to call it an alternative consultation." He gave a humorless smile. "Think carefully, Ms. Reed. Your salary at the defender's office barely pays the bills. With this money, you could help your father retire comfortably." Mentioning her father made Anne narrow her eyes. "How do you know about my dad?" Kelly's smile faltered. "We did our research. Thomas Reed, cab driver, former client of Paul Morrison, quite a touching story." Anne stood, spine straight. "Thank you for your visit, Mr. Kelly. I have to decline your offer." "Your dad might not like that," Kelly murmured, also getting to his feet. "He understands priorities." "What does that mean?" "It means maybe you should ask him about his connections with Lucas Winters." Kelly adjusted his jacket. "Have a good day, Ms. Reed. The offer stands until the end of the week." Anne stood there, stunned, as he left. The mention of a link between her father and Lucas Winters seemed absurd, yet the certainty in Kelly's words planted a seed of doubt. That night, Anne cancelled her meeting with Paul and drove to the small apartment where her father lived. On the way, she called a contact in the banking records department helping with her investigation. "Mark, I need a favor, urgently. Check if there's any transaction between Thomas Reed and Lucas Winters in the past 5 years. The reply came before she even reached her destination. "Anne, are you sure you want to know this?" Her heart sank. "How much?" "Monthly deposits. Started small 3 years ago. Grew significantly last year. The last one was $50,000, 2 days before the scandal broke." Anne parked, her hands shaking. Her mind refused to accept what the facts suggested. There had to be another explanation. Thomas opened the door with a smile that vanished when he saw Anne's expression. "What happened?" Anne entered without answering, set her purse on the table, and finally turned to face him. "Lucas Winters." The color drained from Thomas's face. It was all the confirmation she needed. "Dad, why?" Thomas sank onto the couch, rubbing his face with both hands. "How did you find out?" "Does it matter? A man offered me money today to sabotage Paul's case." "He mentioned you." Thomas closed his eyes. The silence stretched for long seconds. "It started as a loan," he finally said. 3 years ago, I was drowning in debt. The cab broke down. The rent went up. Lucas approached me, said Paul had mentioned me, that he wanted to help. Did Paul know? No. Lucas said it was better to keep it between us. That Paul had already done too much for me. Anne sat in dazed. "And then? I paid back the loan, but Lucas kept stopping by. Said he had work for me, little favors, delivering packages, watching people, taking photos." "You were spying for him?" Thomas nodded miserably. "At first I thought it was for cases they were working on. Then it started seeming odd. It was always the same people. The deliveries were always to the same places. The people I followed were employees of the firm itself." Anne felt sick. "You knew what they were planning." "Not exactly," Thomas protested weakly. "Not until it was too late. When I realized they were setting Paul up, I tried to back out. Lucas said I was already too deep. They had evidence against me, too. So you chose to save yourself." Anne's voice came out colder than she intended. "I chose to protect you. Thomas stood, desperate. He said they would drag you into it, that the Columbia scholarship could be investigated. Anne looked at her father as though he were a stranger. The man she'd spent her life defending, admiring, suddenly seemed very small. Paul lost everything, she said slowly. He's facing years in prison because of you. He's rich, Anne. He'll bounce back. He's not rich anymore. He's staying in a shelter. His license is revoked. His reputation is ruined. Thomas looked away. What are you going to do? The question hung between them. Anne felt the weight of her decision, her love for her father versus everything she believed in. I'm going to keep defending Paul, she finally said, and you're going to testify. You're going to tell the whole story. Anne, I can't. You can and you will. Her voice left no room for argument. Or I'll tell it myself, and you'll face full legal consequences. Thomas looked devastated. You'd choose him over your own dad? I'm not choosing Paul. I'm choosing the truth. Anne grabbed her purse. What you did is exactly the kind of injustice I swore to fight. Not even for you can I make an exception. When Anne returned to her apartment, she was emotionally drained. Her father's betrayal had stolen something fundamental within her, yet her purpose was clearer than ever. She picked up the phone and called Paul. We need to talk, she said when he answered. I think I found the weak spot in the setup against you. What is it? Anne closed her eyes, pain and determination warring inside her chest. The truth, Paul, as painful as it is. After hanging up, she glanced at her father's photo on the table. Carefully, she turned it face down. The road ahead would be the hardest of her life, destroying the image of the man she loved to save the man who had inspired her. But truth offered no alternatives. Justice provided no shortcuts. Sometimes the price of integrity is losing what we hold most dear. Anne was willing to pay it. The federal court for the Southern District of New York was an imposing building, neoclassical columns, marble steps, symbols of justice carved in stone, a place where power and law converged, where lives were decided under the blind gaze of Lady Justice. That morning, a line formed early at the entrance. Reporters, curious onlookers, law students, all drawn by the year's most talked-about trial. The Morrison case had risen from the ashes, turning from a seemingly solved financial scandal into a potential spectacular judicial mistake. How do you feel today? Asked Mark, one of the few public defenders Anne had allowed to help with preparations. They stood in a small conference room, reserved for the defense. Anne adjusted her folder, checking the documents for the 10th time that morning. Ready? It was half true. Technically, she was more prepared than she'd ever been for any case. Each argument polished, every piece of evidence organized, every witness prepped. But emotionally, she felt as if she were about to jump off a cliff without knowing how deep the water was. The door opened and Paul entered, accompanied by a court officer. He wore a simple but decent suit, not the designer suits that once were his trademark, but something respectful enough for the courtroom. His face showed the strain of recent months, but there was a renewed spark in his eyes. Morning, he said, more to Anne than to Mark. You ready? Anne asked. Paul nodded. As ready as possible, considering I'm about to face my former partner and... He hesitated. And your father. Thomas Reed would be the key witness that day. In the 2 months since Anne learned of his involvement, she had worked with him to ensure he testified fully in exchange for partial immunity. Her relationship with her father was fragile but not entirely broken, just transformed into something new and undefined. He'll do the right thing, Anne said, with more certainty than she felt. A court officer knocked on the door. 5 minutes, Ms. Reed. Anne took a deep breath and closed her folder. Let's go. Courtroom 12 rarely saw this level of turnout. All seats were taken, people stood against the walls, reporters clutched notepads, expressions tense with anticipation. As Anne entered, followed by Paul, a wave of murmurs swept the room. The young public defender and the ex-billionaire attorney, an unlikely duo that had shaken the legal system in recent weeks, with surprising motions and unexpected evidence. Across the aisle, the prosecution team looked less confident than they had at the trial's start. Lead prosecutor Daniel Hoffman spoke in low tones with his assistants, shuffling papers nervously. All rise for the Honorable Judge Miranda Coleman, announced the bailiff. Judge Coleman, known for her rigorous impartiality and low tolerance for stalling tactics, entered with measured steps. At 62, with perfectly styled grey hair and a piercing gaze behind rectangular glasses, she commanded immediate respect. "You may be seated," she said, taking her seat. "We're here for the continuation of the United States v. Pace. Paul Morrison." "I understand the defense has new elements to present." Anne stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Thomas Reed." Another stir ran through the courtroom as Thomas entered. He didn't look at Anne or Paul, keeping his eyes fixed on a distant point ahead. Seated at the witness stand, he seemed to have aged a decade since Anne last saw him. After being sworn in, Anne approached. This was the hardest moment of her career, questioning her own father, exposing his actions, all for a greater truth. "Mr. Reed, please tell the court how you first met Mr. Morrison." Thomas cleared his throat. "He defended me more than 20 years ago. I was falsely accused of taking part in a robbery. And what was the outcome of that case? I was found not guilty, thanks to him." Thomas nodded toward Paul. "After that case, did you maintain contact with Mr. Morrison?" "No, not directly." Anne proceeded methodically, establishing the timeline. How much years later, Lucas Winters approached Thomas offering financial assistance. How the small favors escalated into corporate espionage. How Thomas gradually found himself trapped in a web he couldn't escape. "Mr. Reed," Anne continued, keeping her voice steady, "did you knowingly participate in the plan to frame Paul Morrison in the firm's fund diversion?" Thomas looked briefly at Paul, then at Anne. His eyes were filled with shame and regret. "Yes, I didn't know all the details, but I knew they were setting him up. Lucas Winters told me it was just a strategy to force Paul into retirement, that nobody would actually be harmed. When did you realize it was more than that?" "When I saw the news. The scale of it. I tried contacting Lucas, but he had vanished. Jennifer too." Anne presented bank statements, phone records, and photos Thomas took during his surveillance missions. Piece by piece, she assembled the puzzle showing how Lucas and Jennifer had meticulously framed Paul, using Thomas as a pawn. When the defense finished questioning, Thomas looked drained. Prosecutor Hoffman rose for cross-examination, but his attacks were scattered, as though he realized the case was slipping through his fingers. The defense calls Lucas Winters. The man who entered was the antithesis of Paul, tanned, well-dressed, exuding a smug confidence of someone who believed himself above consequences. He'd been found in Portugal and extradited just 3 weeks earlier after an intense international search. Anne watched him closely as she approached. For the past 2 months, she had studied every available detail about Lucas Winters, his habits, speech patterns, and weaknesses. "Mr. Winters, do you deny fabricating evidence against Paul Morrison?" Lucas gave a slight smile. "I categorically deny it. The evidence speaks for itself. Paul was fully aware of the investments we made. Even if we have proof you forged his signature on key documents." "Alleged proof," Lucas said calmly, "easily contested." Anne took a folder from Mark. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit D47, withdrawal records made by Mr. Winters 3 days before the scandal broke." She handed copies to the judge and the prosecution. The total withdrawn was $12 million. Interestingly, almost identical to the amount deposited into this account in the Cayman Islands. Anne produced another document, an account registered under the name Michael Lindemann, a false identity created using documents obtained by Thomas Reed at Mr. Winters' request. Lucas's confidence visibly faltered. "That's circumstantial. It doesn't prove anything about Paul's guilt." "Not by itself," Anne conceded, "but combined with this," she gestured to Mark, who displayed a large screen of emails. "Emails retrieved from the firm's backup servers showing you Mr. Winters discussing with Jennifer Thorne how to set Paul up and make sure he signs without reading." The questioning went on for over an hour. Anne systematically dismantled each denial and diversion. Lucas Winters, once the master manipulator of finances, gradually lost his composure under the weight of meticulously organized evidence. "Mr. Winters," Anne said finally, You previously mentioned that all investment decisions were made by a three-person committee. You, Jennifer Thorne, and Paul Morrison. Correct? Yes, that was the standard procedure. Then why? Anne picked up one last document. In the records of this committee's attendance, do we see critical decisions made when Mr. Morrison was verifiably in another location? Anne displayed flight records, hotel confirmations, dated photos. Like this occasion, when Mr. Morrison was in Seattle for the Thornton case, but supposedly approved transfers here in New York. Lucas didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept the courtroom, momentarily landing on faces in the gallery, faces Anne had noticed but not mentioned. Former firm employees who came to witness the collapse of the empire Lucas had built on fraud. Faculty would need to verify those records. No need, Mr. Winters. We already have. And what we found was a systematic pattern of falsification, not only of Paul Morrison's signature, but of his presence, his approval, and ultimately his guilt. After the last witness was excused, Judge Coleman announced a 30-minute recess before closing arguments. In the small defense conference room, Anne remained standing, reordering her notes, trying to ignore her trembling hands. "You were extraordinary in there," Paul said, approaching. "Even at my best, I don't think I could have handled that cross-examination so effectively." Anne gave a slight smile. "I learned from the best, even if indirectly." She looked toward where her father was sitting, in the back of the courtroom after his testimony. Thomas kept his eyes down, avoiding contact with anyone. The cost of his redemption had been high. He wouldn't go to jail thanks to Anne's negotiated deal, but his public confession meant his reputation, his relationships, maybe even his job prospects, were all severely damaged. "He did the right thing in the end," Paul observed, following her gaze. "That counts for something." Anne nodded silently. The past 2 months had been an emotional roller coaster. Her initial anger at her father's betrayal gradually shifting into a reluctant understanding of how good people can make terrible choices when cornered. Thomas wasn't a villain in a simple story of heroes and monsters. He was a flawed man who gave in to fear and need, and now was paying the price. When court reconvened, tension filled the air. The prosecution's closing statement felt almost perfunctory, a final obligatory effort in a case that was unraveling. Then it was Anne's turn. She stood slowly, looking at each jury member before beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case has never been about numbers on spreadsheets or signatures on documents. It's about betrayed trust, about how people in positions of power can manipulate the system for their own ends. And, above all, it's about how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the light." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, not with theatrical drama, but with the conviction of someone who intimately knew the cost of justice. "Paul Morrison is not perfect. Like all of us, he's made mistakes. Perhaps his greatest was trusting people who didn't deserve it. But what the evidence shows, conclusively, is that he did not commit the crimes he's accused of." Anne glanced briefly at Thomas, then at Paul. "This case taught me, and all of us, that justice is not an abstract concept. It's a choice we make every day. The choice to stand by the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts, even when it would be easier to look the other way." As she concluded, the silence in the room was absolute. Not even the usual whispers of reporters or shuffling of papers, only the weight of her words, hovering in the air like an undeniable truth. The jury deliberations, which everyone expected to take days, lasted less than 4 hours. When they returned, their expressions already announced the verdict before it was spoken. In the case of the United States versus Paul Morrison, how does the jury find? The foreperson stood. "On all charges, we find the defendant not guilty." A surge of exclamations rippled through the courtroom. Camera flashes lit up the air. Reporters bolted for the corridors to break the news. Paul remained seated, nearly motionless, as though he couldn't fully grasp what he'd just heard. Anne placed her hand over his, a simple gesture of assurance, while the judge completed formal procedures. Declaring the case closed and Paul Morrison officially free of all charges, the reality began to sink in. This was the end of a nightmare that had lasted almost 2 years. After they finally stood, reporters shouted questions. Photographers positioned themselves to capture the moment. Paul turned to Anne. There was no need for grand words or gestures, just a shared look that contained all the complexity of their joint journey. "Thank you for not forgetting," he murmured, quietly enough that only she could hear. Anne smiled, her eyes reflecting the same intensity she'd had at 6 sitting on that cold police station bench. "I couldn't," she replied simply. "You taught me what justice is." In that moment, seeing the relief and understanding on Paul's face, Anne realized they had closed a circle. Not a perfect circle. There were losses, scars, damaged relationships that might take time to heal, if ever. But a circle of justice that had, despite all the human imperfections involved, was finally complete. And perhaps that, more than any grand celebration, was what really mattered. The fall was painting the city in shades of gold when Anne Reid walked down the hallway of the public defender's office, coffee in one hand and case files in the other. 6 months had passed since the trial that changed so many lives. The office remained the same, peeling walls, slow computers, that old printer that jammed daily. But Anne carried a new confidence. The Morrison case had transformed her from a promising rookie into a respected defender. "Read the Star," joked Miguel as she passed by. "Saw your picture in the court bulletin?" Impressing the judges again. Anne smiled without replying and sat at her desk. She opened the first file, a young man accused of robbery who swore he was somewhere else. The kind of case she now saw as possibility, not obstacle. Grace Chen stopped by. "How's your dad doing?" A loaded question. After the trial, Anne's relationship with Thomas became complex. Neither fully broken nor fully mended. He now lived upstate, working as a driver. "He's okay," Anne replied. "We spoke last week. He seems at peace." "And Morrison, any news?" Anne shook her head. After the trial, Paul had virtually disappeared. Last report said he'd moved to the West Coast, avoiding interviews and social circles. Nothing beyond what we already know. That wasn't entirely true. Paul had called once, 3 months after the trial, just to see how she was doing. The conversation was brief, almost formal. The morning went by in its usual bustle, phone calls, paperwork, a visit to the detention center. The defender's office never slowed. Returning with a sandwich for lunch, Anne noticed an envelope on her keyboard. Plain, white. Her name in an elegant handwriting she recognized immediately. She sat down, lunch forgotten, and carefully opened it. Inside was just a simple card, and attached to it an old-fashioned key. The note was brief. "Your gesture changed everything. Thank you for reminding me who I used to be." No signature, but it didn't need one. Along with the card was a small newspaper clipping from a coastal town in California. "New free legal aid center opens its doors." The photo showed a restored Victorian house. The text mentioned only that the center was established by an experienced attorney who preferred to remain anonymous. Anne smiled, understanding without need for explanation. Paul had found his way to start over, not in corporate spotlights, but in the quiet work that truly mattered. The key, she assumed, was symbolic. Maybe to that center's front door, or maybe to something deeper. The key to a new life. She placed the card and the key in her drawer, beside her dad's photo and the old Mr. Buttons. She picked up her sandwich and got back to work. Hours later, after her last hearing, Anne was alone in the office. The late afternoon silence brought a rare tranquility. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. She took out the card again. "Your gesture changed everything." It was ironic how life worked in circles. His gesture, 20 years ago, had changed everything for her. Now her own gesture had completed the cycle. It wasn't a perfect story. Her father still lived with the consequences of his bad choices. Paul, despite being cleared, would never fully recover what he'd lost. She herself bore scars, but maybe perfection was never the goal. Anne put the card away and tidied her desk for the next day. New cases awaited, new stories of people needing someone to believe in them. She recalled a conversation with Paul while preparing for the trial. He mentioned how, despite all his success, his career had lost something essential, the pure feeling of making a difference in someone's life. "That's what I felt that day," he explained. "When I saw you and your dad, it was real, Not calculated, just human. Anne smiled as she stepped out into the evening. Justice wasn't something you bought with connections or power. It was something you nurtured patiently, like a gardener planting seeds with no guarantee of harvest. And when you least expected it, it blossomed like the most improbable flowers, born from gratitude. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.